The Death of the West: How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization, by Patrick J. Buchanan. Chapter 9: Intimidated Majority. Civil rights laws were not passed to protect the rights of white men, and do not apply to them. Mary Berry, Chairman, U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Why did Christians permit their God and faith to be driven out of the temples of their civilization? Why was their resistance so feeble? Napoleon said that God is on the side of the big battalions, but in America the Christians were the big battalions, and they were supposed to be on God's side. Yet they were beaten, horse, foot, and dragoons. In his book Long March, Roger Kimball, an editor at New Criterion, attributes the rout on the cultural front to a failed conservative movement. The long march of America's cultural revolution has succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of all but the most starry-eyed utopians. The great irony is that this victory took place in the midst of a significant drift to the center-right in electoral politics. The startling and depressing fact is that supposed conservative victories at the polls have done almost nothing to challenge the dominance of left-wing, emancipationist attitudes and ideas in our culture. On the contrary, in the so-called culture wars, conservatives have been conspicuous losers. Despite the hollow boasts of some conservatives that we won the culture war, candor compels one to concede Kimball is right. But why are traditionalists in retreat? Christians and conservatives did not lack for pulpits or microphones, from talk radio to cable TV, from the internet to the magazines. After 1968, Republicans won more battles than they lost, and did not lack political power. Polls showed the country was on their side of the barricades in the culture wars. Americans opposed women in combat, abortion on demand, and racial preferences. They favored prayer in the public schools and posting the Ten Commandments. They wanted immigration reduced, and English made America's language. Yet, on the moral, social, and cultural fronts, Republicans, conservatives, and Christians have been in almost continuous retreat and are today, by and large, an intimidated lot. The White House refused to step in while John Ashcroft was beaten bloody by Teddy Kennedy and the Democrats of the Judiciary Committee. Neither Mr. Bush nor his running mate attended the 2000 convention of the Christian Coalition. Mr. Bush sent a tape, but he did make time in his campaign schedule to meet with the gay Republicans from the Log Cabin Club. When the Confederate battle flag became a blazing controversy, Governor Bush said it was for South Carolinians to decide. But, as soon as the primary was over, he ordered memorial plaques to Confederate war dead taken down from the Texas Supreme Court. Not one speaker at the Republican convention in Philadelphia was allowed to defend the party's position on the defining moral issue of life. Yet Colin Powell was given prime time to lecture the party on its supposed hypocrisy in opposing affirmative action. And the chastening Republicans dutifully smiled through their public caning. On the social and moral issues that once defined Reaganism, the party has fled the field. It's a different Republican Party, was the convention spin. Yes, it is, with pandering the fashion in Philadelphia. Malevolent wit Bill Maher mocked that the last time the Republicans had this many blacks up on the stage, they were selling them. When Mr. Bush sought to reach out to the NAACP by addressing its convention, the NAACP reciprocated with an attack ad featuring the daughter of James Byrd, implying that Mr. Bush's opposition to a hate crimes law meant he did not care about her father's lynching. Whenever critics demand that Republicans reach out to those who have again and again bitten their hand, the party obediently reaches out and is bitten again, to the undying amusement of its tormentors. National Review summarized the success of the politics of appeasement. Bush tried, more than any previous Republican candidate had, not to offend liberal sensitivities on race. He embraced immigration, supported bilingual education, obscured his position on race preferences, appeared before the NAACP, split the difference on hate crimes, and had Colin Powell guilt-trip the Republican convention. His reward? 35% of the Hispanic vote, and a smaller share of the black vote than Bob Dole got in 1996. Conservatives have lost the moral certitude they had when they were young and theirs was a fighting faith. Now they seem desperately anxious to reassure the public that they are really not bigots, but every bit as warm-hearted and well-intentioned as their accusers. After Mr. Bush chose his cabinet, NAACP Chair Julian Bond said he had selected nominees from the Taliban wing of American politics, appeased the wretched appetite of the extreme right wing, and chosen cabinet officials whose devotion to the Confederacy is nearly canine in its uncritical affection. House Majority Leader Richard Army wrote NAACP President Kwesi Mfume that such language was racial McCarthyism and reverse race baiting. Deliberate or not, said Army, if left unchallenged, this practice will continue to divide our nation. Army asked for a meeting, but Bond dismissed his letter as a typical complaint of those who oppose justice and fairness. The episode is instructive. One of the highest-ranking Republicans in the nation had requested a meeting with an NAACP whose leaders had smeared his party and vilified the president-elect, and Bond had treated him with contempt. A morally self-confident Republican Party would have lacerated Bond, demanded that the IRS look into the NAACP to ensure it was not violating its tax exemption by engaging in partisan attacks, cut off discretionary federal funds to the NAACP until Bond was fired, written the major donor corporations of the NAACP to ask if they support demagogic attacks on the president, and amended the tax laws to punish foundations like Ford, which finance with tax-free dollars the trashing of the president and the Republican Party. How should conservatives deal with the NAACP? The same way liberal Democrats deal with the religious right. Instead, Mr. Army asked for dialogue. Fighting back in the culture war has become incompatible with the new Republican image. Since Ronald Reagan departed, the media have whispered in Republican ears, moral and social issues are losers, drop them, or go down to defeat. Republicans have gotten the message and become conscientious objectors in the culture war. America, too, seems to have lost her moral certitude. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower sent illegal aliens packing in Operation Wetback and apologized to no one for defending U.S. borders and ordering intruders to go home. Republicans today will not even demand that we seal a border that 1.5 million aliens attempt to breach every year. No one wants to be called a nativist. When the conservative weekly Human Events interviewed 17 members of the House and Senate, asking if they supported the deportation of illegal aliens who broke our laws and broke into the country, only 2 flatly said yes. Because Hispanic Americans might retaliate against members of Congress who demand that our immigration laws be enforced, Congress will not insist that the President enforce them. Such cowardice could cost us our country. There has been a terrible attrition of will to do what is necessary to preserve the unique nation that America once was. At that Portland State commencement, where Mr. Clinton said that in 50 years there would be no majority race left in America, students broke out in spontaneous applause. Surely it is a rarity in history that a people would cheer news that they and their children would soon be dispossessed of their inheritance as the majority in the nation their ancestors built. The moral rot is even more widespread in Europe. Nations that in the 20th century fielded million-man armies today lack the will to raise sufficient troops to provide for their own defense. They prefer to let the Americans do it. Europe's populations are shrinking, and its nations are breaking apart, but few seem to care. Full of guilt, the Germans seem to want to lose themselves inside the warm cocoon of a united Europe. Other nations, too, seem weary of striving to be independent and free, as they prepare to accept the dictates of a European superstate. Nations are the wealth of mankind. They are its generalized personalities. The smallest of them has its own particular colors, and embodies a particular facet of God's design, said Solzhenitsyn. The disappearance of nations would impoverish us no less than if all the peoples were made alike, with one character, one face. Yet the nations of Europe seem reconciled to the reality that their time on this earth may be coming to an end. Leaders who wish to preserve their unique national identity and character are branded as racists and xenophobes. In Denmark, Interior Minister Karen Jespersen, a 1960s radical, ignited a storm of indignation by suggesting that refugees with criminal records be put on a deserted island. She did not wish to live, said Jespersen, in a multicultural nation, where the cultures were considered equal. Denmark has become a haven for political refugees, but Danish hospitality is being exploited by criminal gangs from Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Ukraine. Jespersen's comment about preferring her own culture followed a series of gang rapes by Middle Eastern immigrants of Danish women, and demands that Danish law be made to conform to Islamic law, with new restrictions on women, return of the death penalty, and mutilations as punishments for theft. Europe was aghast at Ms. Jespersen. Reactions were fast and furious, wrote Henrik Bering in Policy Review. The European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia was instantly on her case. But as 33% of Denmark's social budget goes for that 4% of the nation's population that consists of non-Western immigrants, Danes are starting to tune out Europe and tune in Karen. Something vital has gone out of Europe. In The Suicide of the West, written in 1964, Cold War strategist James Burnham detected a mindset that reconciles Western peoples to the death of their empires and the eclipse of their civilizations. Burnham called it an ideology of Western suicide. The disease now appears to have become an epidemic. Why have conservatives not acted more decisively to roll back a revolution that threatens their civilization and culture? There are several reasons. First, the followers of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan were drawn into politics by the conviction that America was losing the Cold War. Their movement was unprepared, unequipped, untrained for a culture war. And with the election of Ronald Reagan, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the great cause that had united them was gone. Moreover, many conservatives in politics, journalism, and broadcasting are far better versed in economics and foreign policy than in history, philosophy, or theology. As one wit has observed, Republicans were put on this earth to cut taxes. At times, it seems that is the only reason they were put on this earth. Unschooled in matters of morality and culture, many are uncomfortable with such issues, have no interest in them, and don't believe they belong in politics. The late Richard Weaver had these conservatives in mind when he wrote that many traditional positions in our world have suffered, not so much because of inherent defect as because of the stupidity, ineptness, and intellectual sloth of those who are presumed to have their defense in charge. Confronted with moral, social, or cultural issues, these conservatives move swiftly off them and onto taxes and defense, where they feel on terra firma. But despite an ardent Republican wish that this culture war would just pass away, it will not pass away. For, as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Second, by capturing the institutions where the young spend most of their waking hours, MTV and primetime, movies and magazines, schools and colleges, the revolution is able to shape the values, beliefs, and attitudes of the young. Artists, actors, playwrights, songwriters, and popular singers are almost all on the other side. Op-ed page commentators and radio and TV talk show hosts cannot match this cultural firepower. The arsenals are unequal. Moreover, the entertainment that the Cultural Revolution has on offer is far more attractive and alluring. Thus, many of the children of traditionalists defect. Though, as they grow older, Many prodigal sons and daughters do ruefully return to their father's house. Half a century ago, literary critic Lionel Trilling could write, "In the United States at this time, liberalism is not only the dominant, but even the sole intellectual tradition. For it is the plain fact that nowadays there are no conservative or reactionary ideas in general circulation." Though an exaggeration even then, Trilling's line yet contains a core of truth. And since the 60s, there has been a population explosion among the creators of culture and shapers of thought. Intellectuals, social critics, teachers, journalists, writers, bureaucrats, and artists. Suddenly, conservatives were not just outnumbered, they were overwhelmed. Crane Britton, in his Anatomy of Revolution, writes that one sign of a markedly unstable society is the sudden appearance of a great host of intellectuals, bitterly attacking existing institutions and desirous of a considerable alteration in society, business, and government. Purely metaphorically, we may compare intellectuals of this sort to the white corpuscles, guardians of the bloodstream. But there can be an excess of white corpuscles, and when this happens, you have a diseased condition. By Britton's definition, America would appear to be close to that diseased condition. Third, unlike normal politics, where a middle ground can usually be found and a compromise reached, culture war is a zero-sum game. One side's gain is the other's loss. Abortion, assisted suicide, and gay marriage are moral questions that call for a yes or no from politicians who prefer to split the difference and meet in the moderate middle. Republicans, most of whom do not consider politics a blood sport, are unprepared for the no-quarter combat that critical theory entails, with its savage rhetoric and attack politics. In the old politics, incumbents pointed with pride and challengers viewed with alarm. In a culture war, the revolution is always on the attack, and traditionalists are always on the defense. Strength lies not in defense, but in attack, wrote a budding cultural revolutionary by the name of Adolf Hitler. Consider the 30 Years' War for control of the command post of the culture war, the Supreme Court. Two of Mr. Nixon's nominees, federal judges Clement Haynsworth and G. Harold Carswell, were scourged and rejected. Two of Ronald Reagan's nominees, federal judges Robert Bork and Douglas Ginsburg, were savaged and rejected, the latter for marijuana indiscretions as a law professor. Bork's name became a verb, to bork, meaning to shred a nominee's reputation before casting him aside. George Bush's nominee, Clarence Thomas, had to run an Iroquois gauntlet. Contrast this back-alley butchery of conservative jurists to the high-tea treatment accorded Clinton nominees Stephen Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Each was introduced with respect and easily confirmed. The core constituencies of the Democratic Party understand culture war, while many Republicans seem blissfully unaware there even is a war. Politics stops at the water's edge, and partisanship ends when the sun goes down, are the cliches of yesterday. A culture war is what Mao called a permanent revolution. If the Confederate battle flag comes down in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, the front moves to Mississippi. When all the flags are down, the statues and portraits go next, then the school names, until all public homage paid to Dixie's heroes is forever abolished. Fourth, 30 years of pounding have pulverized Christian morale. Unlike the era of the bells of St. Mary's and the song of Bernadette, priests and preachers are now, as often as not, portrayed in movies and on TV as hypocritical and lecherous, or intolerant and backward. Who wants to stand up for family values when the price is public ridicule? Like every institution, the churches have been under constant fire and exhibit signs of battle fatigue. Beset by schisms over abortion and homosexuality, plagued by scandals from womanizing televangelists to pedophile priests, they are not the churches of yesterday. Like muscle tissue, moral authority unexercised atrophies and dies. To watch Catholic senators, without sanction by their bishops, sustain Bill Clinton's veto of a ban on partial birth abortion, infanticide to Senator Moynihan, is to see how far downhill the old church has slipped and stumbled since the confident years of Pius VII. Constant charges of racism, sexism, homophobia, and bigotry have taken a toll on traditionalist morale. The cost of continuing to fight seems intolerably high. Many have given in to defeatism and despair, and whine like Hollywood stars and starlets who threaten to leave the country rather than live in George Bush's America. So, Christians save their protest for the privacy of the voting booth. But those they elect often have no more stomach for this battle than they do. Justice Clarence Thomas spoke of the price of resistance at the American Enterprise Institute dinner in 2001. Active citizens are often subjected to truly vile attacks. They are branded as mean-spirited, racist, Uncle Tom, homophobic, sexist, said the justice. Under such assaults, he added, we censor ourselves. This is not civility. It is cowardice. As a federal official, Thomas had questioned the wisdom of affirmative action and busing for racial balance. Black leaders charged him with treason to his people. The purpose, said Thomas, was intimidation. The intimidators failed with Clarence Thomas, but succeeded with some conservatives who, like defeated peoples, no longer make demands. They just want to get along. But in a culture war, where the other side is always making demands, and the other side is always ready to fight, this translates into endless retreats and eventual defeat. Fifth, God and country people are raised to respect and obey their rulers. Judicial revolutionaries like Warren, Douglas, and Brennan relied on the innate conservatism of the silent majority when they imposed their radical agenda. Many Americans were enraged, but felt they must obey. After all, this was the Supreme Court. As long as Americans believe that their government is acting constitutionally, they will obey. By definition, conservatives are not rebels. But neither were the Founding Fathers until pushed to the wall. Finally, a new generation has now grown up for whom the Cultural Revolution is not a revolution at all, but the culture they were born into and have known all their lives. Public homosexuality, pornography, abortion, trash talk on TV and in movies, and filthy lyrics in popular music have all been around since before they can remember. No big deal. Many have come to accept the axioms of modernity about how wicked the old America was. It is the traditional culture they find odd. They have passed through schools and universities, consumed the fare, and come to believe what they were taught about the country's old heroes and history. We will steal your children, the 60s radicals howled at Middle America. They did. And with an intolerant new cultural elite now ascendant, a failing of conservatives is that they are conservatives. In the 1770s, there came a time when conservative men like Washington and John Hancock realized they too must become rebels like Patrick Henry and Sam Adams. When the French Revolution was on the march, in the persons of Robespierre and Bonaparte, it was good to have Edmund Burke, but one also needed Nelson and the Iron Duke. The first thing we have to learn about fighting and winning a culture war, said Dr. Sam Francis, the syndicated columnist and author of Revolution from the Metal, is that we are not fighting to conserve something. We are fighting to overthrow something. We must understand clearly and firmly that the dominant authorities in the major foundations, the media, the schools, the universities, and most of the system of organized culture, including the arts and entertainment, not only do nothing to conserve what most of us regard as our traditional way of life, but actually seek its destruction or are indifferent to its survival. If our culture is going to be conserved, then we need to dethrone the dominant authorities that threaten it. We traditionalists, who love the culture and country we grew up in, are going to have to deal with this question. Do we simply conserve the remnant, or do we try to take the culture back? Are we conservatives, or must we also become counter-revolutionaries and overthrow the dominant culture? Americans who look on this cultural revolution as politics as usual do not understand it. It means to make an end of the country we love. It cannot be appeased. Its relentless, reckless use of terms like extremist, sexist, racist, homophobe, nativist, xenophobe, fascist, and Nazi testifies to how seriously it takes the struggle and how it views those who resist. To true believers in the revolution, the right is not just wrong, the right is evil. Here is Jesse Jackson, premier voice of Black America, after the 1994 GOP victory. Hate and hurt are on a roll in America. If what was happening here was happening in South Africa, it'd be called racist apartheid. If it was happening in Germany, we'd call it Nazism. And in Italy, we'd call it fascism. Here we call it conservatism. As Mr. Bush's team was winning the Florida recount battle, Jackson reverted, "If George Bush wins, it'll be by Nazi tactics. We'll take to the streets right now. We'll delegitimize Bush, discredit him, do whatever it takes, but never accept him." To Julian Bond, critics of affirmative action are neo-fascists. To Atlanta's ex-mayor, Maynard Jackson, the Confederate battle flag is a swastika. To Congresswoman Maxine Waters, John Ashcroft is a racist. Missouri Congressman William Clay said of Mr. Bush's decision to name Ashcroft, "This is the way the Ku Klux Klan members work to improve race relations. They too reached out to blacks with nooses and burning crosses." Equating conservatives with Nazis and Klansmen dates at least as far back as Dr. King, who professed to see in the Goldwater campaign the danger signs of Hitlerism. The slander is now common, because the cost is free. Few journalists will call black leaders to account, for some share their animus against conservatives, while others agree with Marcuse, who advocated intolerance towards conservatives to delegitimize the right as beyond the pale of acceptable politics. Calling opponents Nazis, fascists, and Klansmen, when it carries no penalty, can be rewarding. It places an opponent outside the company of decent men, discredits in advance what he says, and forces him to defend his character rather than his positions. And there are psychic rewards. After all, if one is standing up to Nazis or Knight Riders, that is surely more heroic than standing up to Denny Hatstern or Dick Armey. The more one demonizes an enemy, the more one heroizes oneself. In the demonization of the right, there is also fantasizing by the left. Mr. Clinton spoke grimly of black churches being burned by racists in the Arkansas of his boyhood, but it never happened. Mr. Gore can break into tears relating how he vowed to fight big tobacco to the last ditch as he watched his beloved sister die of lung cancer. Only later did we learn that Mr. Gore was still bundling with big tobacco long after his sister's death. This Walter Mitty fantasizing explains how Al Gore invented the internet, discovered Love Canal, and saw his steamy romance with Tipper inspire the writing of Love Story. In Gore's mind, it may just have happened that way. And when Jesse Jackson compares a Florida legal battle to Selma, He not only casts Republican lawyers as the club-wielding troopers of Bull Connor with their attack dogs, but himself as the hero of Selma Bridge. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons, laments T.S. Eliot's J. Alfred Prufrock. So too have our cultural elites. But in their minds, they daily heave a cutlass against Nazis, fascists, and Klansmen who would otherwise fall upon defenseless and persecuted minorities. Why shouldn't one feel good about oneself? For today's progressive, the West Wing of President Josiah Bartlett is the real world. The politics of posture entails no pain. Consider again Ms. Sontag's "The white race is the cancer of human history. The white race, and it alone, eradicates autonomous civilizations wherever it spreads." Rewrite that sentence with Jewish race in place of white race, and the passage would fit nicely into Mein Kampf. Had Sontag so savaged the Jewish people, her career would have ended there, but her diatribe against the white race no more diminished her standing than her 1968 visit to Hanoi, when the North Vietnamese were torturing American POWs. Sontag subsequently won a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, and one recent survey found her the most respected intellectual of our time. Yet, as Tom Wolfe of Radical Chic and Bonfire of the Vanities fame asked about Sontag, who was this woman? Who and what? A Max Weber? An Arnold Toynbee? Actually, she was just another scribbler who spent her life signing up for protest meetings and lumbering to the podium, encumbered by her prose style, which had a handicapped parking sticker valid at partisan review. Sontag, said Wolfe, seemed hell-bent on illustrating the truth of McLuhan's observation that moral indignation is a technique used to endow the idiot with dignity. Ultimately, it is the dream of every victim to exchange places with his oppressor, wrote Frantz Fanon, the revolutionary. Fanon's insight helps to explain the transformation of the civil rights movement from a social movement in the American tradition of women's suffrage and the labor movement into an arm of the revolution. In the 1950s, African Americans could still be described as socially conservative, patriotic, proudly Christian. What they wanted, demanded, was to be full and equal members of our national family, to which they and their people had contributed all their lives. America said yes. Black and white together, America went out and buried Jim Crow. We seemed on the way to a more united country. But when the valid grievances had been redressed, and the legitimate demands for equal rights under law had been met, America's attention moved elsewhere. Civil rights became yesterday's story. To recapture the nation's attention, new demands had to be invented, and when they were met, still newer demands. Desegregation was now no longer enough. Affirmative action, quotas, set-asides, equality of result in jobs, pay, and income, and legislative and congressional districts redrawn to guarantee a fair share of the seats of power were demanded. Racial balance had to be achieved in classrooms, even if it meant forced busing of white children into dangerous inner-city schools. The old battle cry of freedom gave way to the new non-negotiable demands for black power. In 1971, the Supreme Court heard a case in which a white law student was protesting his failure to be admitted to the Arizona bar, though he had a higher score on the bar exam than black students who had been admitted. During court discussions, Justice Thurgood Marshall turned to his colleague William Douglas and said, "You guys have been discriminating for years. Now it is our turn." The civil rights movement melded with the Cultural Revolution, and militant leaders had ever newer demands. Songs like Dixie must never again be publicly sung. Robert E. Lee must no longer be honored. As Washington was a slave owner, his name and the names of all former slave owners should be removed from schools that black children attend. Mark Twain's books contain racial slurs. Get them out. The Confederate battle flag is a symbol of racism. Replicas must be removed from all state flags, or boycotts will be imposed. Immigration laws must put third world peoples first in line to increase diversity. We also need new hate crimes laws that single out for special punishment and re-education whites who attack blacks. And now we would like to sit down and discuss reparations for slavery. Every successful revolution puts on in time the robe of the tyrant it has deposed, said Barbara Tuchman. Every political cause, added Eric Hoffer, eventually becomes a business, and then degenerates into a racket. Civil rights has become a racket. All Americans of goodwill would offer a hand to alleviate the social catastrophe in black America. For, after all, African Americans are children of the same God, and citizens of the same republic. But the Jacksons, Sharptons, and Bonds do not want our help. They want to bait us, provoke us, and demonize us. For that is how they keep the pot boiling, the TV producers calling, and the federal and foundation grants rolling in. If Theodore Bilbo and Bull Connor are dead and gone, new white racists must be found, even if they have to be invented, like John Ashcroft and George W. Bush. Booker T. Washington warned America to be wary of these race racketeers. There is a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habits of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. Write down the smokestack, Dr. Washington. When an argument revolves around issues of race, Republicans go limp. They seem intimidated to the point of paralysis. Why? As fair-minded and mostly Christian folks, they concede that there is truth in the indictment of America's past. Our fathers did participate in slavery. We did practice segregation. Our treatment of the Indians was not what one should have expected of people to whom the Sermon on the Mount was divine command. But having internalized a guilt that gnaws at their souls, these Republicans, in their lifelong quest for absolution, are easy prey for confidence men like Jackson and Sharpton who run the big sting. The truth? In the story of slavery and the slave trade, Western man was among the many villains. But Western man was also the only hero. For the West did not invent slavery, but it alone abolished slavery. Had it not been for the West, African rulers would still be trafficking in the flesh of their kinsmen. Slaves, after all, were the leading cash crop of the friends of Mansa Musa. In Mauritania and Sudan today, slavery has returned, to the deafening silence of intellectuals who have built careers on the moral shakedown of America and the West. America was a segregated society, but in no other nation do people enjoy greater freedom, opportunity, and prosperity than here in the United States. The time for apologies is past, but if Middle America believes that capitulations and reparations will buy peace in our time, it deludes itself. If there were no more demands, the race racketeers would have to find a new line of work. But as long as the silent majority keeps acceding to their demands, they will keep on making them. Time to just say no. The degradation of civil rights and the merger of that movement with the Cultural Revolution compounds the risks of the balkanization of America. For where FDR's New Deal coalition was based on economics, the haves versus the have-nots, the new Democratic coalition is based on bloc voting and ethnic politics. If the party loses its lock on Black America, no Democratic lock on the presidency is possible. That is a political fact of life. Thus, Democrats have an immense stake in sustaining the fear and loathing of Republicans among African Americans. In every election of the 1990s, the race card was played, by stoking the fear that either black churches would be burned or black voters disenfranchised. In the 2000 election, Mr. Gore went to a black church in Pittsburgh to offer these reflections on his rival. When my opponent, Governor Bush, says that he will appoint strict constructionists to the Supreme Court, I often think of the strictly constructionist meaning that was applied when the Constitution was written, and how some people were considered 3/5 of a human being. Mr. Gore was implying that Mr. Bush had no real problem with slavery. Divisive? Yes, but it paid off. African Americans turned out in record numbers in many states and voted 11 to 1 for Albert Gore. With the White House the prize, why would Democrats give up a race card that is the ace of trumps in urban America? What would Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson do in a high stakes poker game where the race card has been dropped from the deck? The more interesting questions: why do Republicans continue, election after election, to devote such energy and effort trying to crack the most solid voting bloc the Democratic Party has? Why do they not go hunting where the ducks are? The Republicans' largest and most loyal voting bloc is America's majority. In 1972, Mr. Nixon won 67% of the white vote. In 1984, Mr. Reagan won 64%. Mr. Bush won 54%, but 60% of white males. As whites still cast 82% of the ballots, if Republicans can raise their share of that vote from 54 to 60%, almost no other votes are needed. White males are the victims of quotas, affirmative action, set-asides, and reverse discrimination. They are the preferred targets of abuse by academics, journalists, and feminists, as well as the Jacksons, Sharptons, and Bonds. Yet, none of their attackers are beloved of middle America. If the GOP would come out for an end to racial preferences and a moratorium on immigration, and appeal to the great silent majority as Democrats appeal to minorities, the party's chances in national elections could not but improve. One recalls that the first President Bush won the White House by draping the weekend pass Michael Dukakis gave murderer Willie Horton and his ACLU membership card around Dukakis' neck. And the first President Bush lost the White House by raising taxes and signing a quota bill to reach out to dissidents who invariably pay Republicans back with a wet mitten across the face. The Two Americas. When you come to a fork in the road, take it, said Yogi Berra. The Republican Party is at a fork in the road, and the decision it takes will be as fateful as the one it took at the San Francisco Cow Palace in 1964, when the party chose Barry Goldwater in that time when bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, to be young, very heaven. As commentators left and right are discovering, race and culture are becoming decisive in presidential politics. Blacks, Hispanics, and Jewish Americans voted in landslides for Gore, but his 60% vote among white males made Mr. Bush president. A county-by-county electoral map shows America becoming two nations. Al Gore swept the coastal counties of Washington, Oregon, and California, but carried barely a single county east of the coast. Of some 230 counties in Nevada, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Kansas, Gore carried 3. Gore did well coming up the Mississippi River Valley from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, Memphis, St. Louis, the Quad Cities, and St. Paul. But beyond the river cities and their suburbs, Gore was crushed in these mid-American states. As historian Ralph Ryko wrote, you can drive across America by almost any route without going through a single county carried by Gore. But it is almost impossible to drive through any state except Rhode Island without crossing counties that went for Bush. What defines the new politics of the 21st century? According to the Washington Post, it is morality and culture. Battles over abortion, gun control, and other cultural values are dramatically reshaping the voting behavior of the American electorate, turning longtime working-class white Democrats into Republicans and moving many affluent whites from the GOP to the party of Roosevelt. Racial issues such as busing and affirmative action have pushed blue-collar voters into the GOP, at the same time that cultural issues, especially abortion rights, have built Democratic allegiance among white professionals. Among Americans who earn $50,000 a year or more, once solid Republican voters, Bush's margin was cut to 7%. The American Bar Association and American Medical Association were once Republican bastions, no longer. Now they are considered hostile fiefdoms. Of the media, that has long since been true. On election night, writes analyst Terry Teachout, CNN staffers had to be warned not to cheer when the network's anchors announced that Gore had been declared the winner of a state, lest their cheers be heard by viewers. But if professional elites are moving left, poor whites are moving to the right. An exchange of electorates is taking place. The Post's Tom Edsall discovered that in 9 out of the 10 poorest counties in Kentucky, places where the Democratic Party of Harry S. Truman ran roughshod over Republican adversaries, George W. Bush won, frequently by margins the mere image of Gore's in the richest and best educated counties. Gore lost every income segment of white America, except for those earning under $50,000 a year, and he split this vote with Bush 49 to 46, an astonishing loss of loyalty among poor whites for the party of the people. The only 3 issues in my district, an Oklahoman congressman told this writer a few years back, are God, gays, and guns. Race aside, frequency of church attendance has become almost the best indicator of how a person will vote. Those who go to church weekly and more often vote Republican by landslides. Those who attend church rarely or never vote Democratic. Yes, Virginia, we are 2 countries. In the 2000 election, the Republican ticket ran away from issues of race, culture, and life, assuming correctly that the hostility to and even detestation of Clinton and Gore would bring social conservatives home. They were right. But the Gore-Nader 3 million vote margin over Bush-Cheney may be the last wake-up call the Republican Party will receive. If Mr. Bush and his White House do not champion the cause of life, of a colorblind society, and of traditional values, those causes will be lost. And if the Republican Party refuses, once in power, to offer leadership to moral and cultural conservatives, as well as to economic conservatives, many will give up on the party and politics as well. For Mr. Bush, the litmus test is the Supreme Court. Nomination of a pro-choice justice would dishearten and demoralize the right. If the president lets the next seat go to the Souter Stevens Ginsburg Breyer wing of the court, the only argument left for the GOP is that it is the lesser of 2 evils, and that is not enough. What Joe Louis said of his light heavyweight challenger Billy Conn is true for the president in the culture wars. He can run, but he can't hide. No matter what compassionate conservatives may wish, the culture war and racial conflict are not going away. Too many have a vested interest. African Americans and Hispanics are a fourth of our population. Both vote increasingly as blocs in presidential elections. Our media, too, have a stake in racial conflict. Ratings and the ad dollars that flow from them require conflict, and no conflict save war itself is more riveting than racial conflict. The O.J. trial may have divided and polarized America, but it guaranteed a successful year at CNN. The ballooning budgets of federal agencies, the EEOC, the Civil Rights Commission, the Civil Rights Divisions of Justice, Education, and HHS, require a steady supply of fresh victims of racism. The more money these agencies receive, the more violators and victims they must find. By Parkinson's law, the work expands to fill the time allotted. Civil rights has also attracted the trial lawyers. A news report that a black customer has been sassed or a black diner denied service is a winning lottery ticket. For being slow to serve 6 black Secret Service agents in Annapolis, Denny's parent company had to pay $54 million to 295,000 plaintiffs and their lawyers, and to sign an agreement with the NAACP to hire more African Americans and patronize more minority-owned suppliers. Reverend Jackson's 1980s boycott of Anheuser-Busch was resolved so amicably that by 2000, his sons Yusef and Jonathan were running the largest Anheuser-Busch distributorship in Chicago. The Chicago Sun-Times reports that after Jackson threatened protests against mergers of GTE and Bell Atlantic, AT&T and CTI, he changed his tune when they donated to Jackson-led groups and agreed to Jackson's demands by giving contracts to minority business owners, at least some of whom Jackson introduced to the corporate chiefs. Countless are the ways to keep hope alive. Black employees of the Christian Coalition, who claim they were not invited to a Christmas party and had to serve at an inaugural dinner rather than sit with other employees, have sued for the damage done their psyches and self-esteem. The sum demanded $621 million. Racial racketeering is not going away. Indeed, it is going global. In Durban, South Africa in September 2000, the United Nations hosted a world conference against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Purpose: extract a formal U.S. apology for transatlantic slavery, and a commitment to tens of billions in reparations to African Americans for this nation's historic crime against humanity. Reverend Jackson and his Black Caucus allies had hoped to have Colin Powell on hand to ensure worldwide coverage, as his country was indicted, convicted, denounced, and ordered to make restitution to all descendants of African slaves. The Bush administration, however, refused its assigned role. Secretary Powell begged off going, and the conference blew up after Arab nations hijacked it and converted it into a drumhead court-martial of Israel for racism and apartheid. The low-level U.S. delegation walked out, but this is not the last Americans will hear of reparations for slavery, for the would-be beneficiaries have too large a stake in running the scam. With the media, the Democratic Party, the federal bureaucracy, the trial lawyers, the UN, and the Third World all having huge investments in racial politics, we will endure it until Western nations decide they have had enough and walk away from the game. But that may be too much to expect of an intimidated people.